At 9 a.m. on the 15th of September 1867, a wagon train of 27 wagons halted at a clearing in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains in the Washington Territory. The journey from Independence, Missouri had taken 7 months. The train had lost 11 people to cholera, 3 to drowning during a river crossing, and 2 to a falling tree. The survivors had been traveling for days through alpine forests and rocky passes, and they were exhausted. But on this morning, a different event was ready to begin. A wedding was to take place at the edge of the wilderness. The bridegroom, a man named Samuel Clark, stood at the head of the clearing. He was 24 years old, wearing a coat he had kept folded in his trunk since leaving Missouri. The preacher, a circuit rider who had attached himself to the train 2 weeks earlier, had opened his Bible at 9 a.m. The ceremony was to start at 9:30 a.m. At 9:15, the bride had not yet appeared. Samuel Clark waited near a pine tree that stood alone at the edge of the clearing. The wagons were arranged in a semicircle around the site. The women of the train had decorated a simple arbor of branches and wildflowers, though most had dried and broken during the night. A table had been set with boiled coffee, cornbread, and dried apples. The children were seated on the ground. The men stood in clusters, their rifles still close at hand. The train had not yet reached the Willamette Valley, and the territory was still claimed by the tribes of the region. The clearing, though quiet, was not safe. At 9:20, a woman named Margaret Hayes walked toward the wagon where the bride was said to be dressing. She knocked. There was no answer. She opened the canvas flap and looked inside. The bride was not there. The bride's belongings were scattered across the floor of the wagon. Her dress, a simple cotton gown that had been sewn during the journey, lay folded on the trunk. Her bonnet was on the seat, but the bride herself had vanished. At 9:30, a search party was formed. Samuel Clark was told what had happened. He stood in place, still facing the arbor, for about a minute. Then he walked toward the wagon and looked inside himself. He did not seem to understand what he was seeing. He turned and asked if anyone had seen her since the previous evening. Several people had. She had been present at the evening meal. She had spoken with her mother about the wedding. She had said she was nervous but ready. By 9:45, the search party had expanded to include every able-bodied adult in the train. They spread out into the forest in pairs. The land here was thick with Douglas fir and western hemlock, and underfoot, moss and rotting logs made walking slow. The air was cold. The scent of pine sap and wet earth filled the clearing. Search parties were told to fire a pistol into the air if they found anything. At 10, a single shot was heard from the eastern edge of the clearing. What happened? The shot came from a pair of searchers who had found a trail of footprints leading into the woods. The footprints were small, consistent with a woman's shoe. They led down toward a small creek that ran through a ravine just east of the camp. The searchers followed the trail for about 200 feet. At the creek, the footprints stopped. The water was clear, running over stones. On the far bank, there were more footprints, but they were different, larger, heavier, made by someone wearing boots. The searchers called out the bride's name. There was no answer. They crossed the creek and followed the larger prints for another 100 feet. Then they found a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. It was the same fabric as the bride's dress. The fabric was white, with small blue flowers printed on it. The bride had been sewing the dress for 3 months. Now it was torn and caught on a branch. The searchers stood still and listened. They heard nothing but the wind moving through the canopy of the trees. The ravine was steep. The walls were covered with moss and ferns. The creek made a constant sound. They saw no signs of anyone else. They fired the pistol and waited. Other searchers arrived. By 10:30, the entire train had stopped looking for the bride and had begun to investigate what might have happened to her. The wagon master, a man named Silas Decker, took charge. He examined the footprints carefully. He knelt beside them, traced the outlines with his finger. He noted that the bride's footprints were evenly spaced, not hurried. She had walked to the creek at a normal pace. The larger boots, however, had been made in a hurry. The spacing was uneven, and the ground was disturbed in a way that suggested someone had been running. The larger prints came from the opposite direction, crossed the creek, and met the bride's prints at the creek bank. From there, they continued together into the forest. The bride had not been alone. Silas Decker called for a count of all persons in the camp. The count came back at 11 minutes past 11. There were two persons missing, the bride and a man named Isaac Thornton. Thornton was a member of the wagon train, but he had joined only 3 weeks earlier after his own party had disbanded following a dispute over a wagon axle. He had been traveling alone. He was 31 years old. He had been quiet. He had kept mostly to himself. No one had thought much of him. But now he was gone and the bride was gone, and the footprints suggested they had left together. How could this have happened? The question for the members of the wagon train was immediate and painful. The bride was a young woman named Eliza Harwood. She was 19 years old. She had been traveling with her parents, her two younger sisters, and her grandmother. She had met Samuel Clark early in the journey when his ox had collapsed and Samuel had needed help repairing his wagon wheel. Eliza had brought him water. They had spoken for perhaps 10 minutes. Over the following weeks, they had spoken again and again. By the time the train reached Fort Laramie, they were engaged. It was not an unusual story. Frontier marriages were often swift because the journey was hard and there was no guarantee of reaching the end. The wedding had been scheduled for the moment the train reached the Willamette Valley, but the train had taken longer than expected. The wedding was moved to an earlier date. It was set for the 15th of September in the only clearing large enough to hold the ceremony. The bride had seemed content. She had spoken of the wedding to her sisters. She had cried once, but her mother said that was normal. The bride had not said anything to suggest she did not want to marry Samuel Clark, but the evidence of her footprints told a different story. She had left the wagon before dawn. She had walked to the creek at a steady pace. She had met Isaac Thornton there. They had gone into the forest together. The torn fabric suggested she might have tried to resist at some point, but there was no sign of violence, no blood, no struggle beyond the torn dress. Silas Decker sent out 2 more search parties, this time armed. He asked the preacher to stay with the women and children near the wagons. He had the wagons pulled closer together. The train was now at risk of losing 2 people, and the surrounding forest was unknown to them. The search parties moved slowly, deliberately into the trees. They followed the creek downstream because the water would have been the fastest route to the valley below. They moved in a line of sight, each man able to see the next. The forest was dark. The canopy let through only fingers of light. The ground was damp. At 12 minutes past 12, one of the search parties found a second torn piece of fabric. This piece was larger, and it was caught on a fallen branch that blocked the path. Underneath the branch, the ground was disturbed. There were signs that someone had sat down or been forced to sit down. A heel print was pressed deep into the moss. The fabric was again from the bride's dress. The search party called out. They heard nothing. They continued. The trail became harder to follow. The footprints crossed a rocky stretch of the creek bed, and after that, almost nothing remained. The search parties spent the next 4 hours sweeping the area in widening circles. By 4 in the afternoon, the light was beginning to fade. Silas Decker called the search parties back to the camp. He did not want the train to be caught at night in unfamiliar forest. He also did not want to leave the women and children alone while the men were spread out across a ravine. The search was suspended until sunrise. The wedding was never held. That night the camp was quiet. The women set out the food that had been prepared for the wedding feast. The men stood watch in shifts. Samuel Clark stayed at the edge of the camp, watching the forest. He did not eat. He did not speak. He simply stood facing the darkness. No one knew what to say to him. The preacher offered a prayer. Samuel did not join. At 7 the next morning, the search resumed. This time, Silas Decker decided to take a small group of 5 men, traveling light, following the creek downstream. He left the train under the command of a deputy. They expected to find Eliza and Isaac Thornton either alive or dead within a few miles. They found neither. The creek wound through the ravine, joined by other small streams, and eventually opened into a narrow valley. The search party followed the valley for 2 more miles. They found no footprints, no clothing, no signs of recent human passage. The forest seemed to have swallowed them completely. The search was extended for 3 more days. The train stayed in the clearing. Cattle were allowed to graze and provisions were rationed. Men from a nearby homestead heard of the missing couple and came to help. But after 5 days, no trace of Eliza Harwood or Isaac Thornton had been found. The search was called off. The train needed to move on. The passes were only open for a few more weeks before snow would close them. The survivors could not stay. The wedding never happened. The bride was never found. Samuel Clark stayed with the train and reached the Willamette Valley a month later. He did not marry again. He never spoke publicly about what happened. The event passed into the history of that train as a mystery, a disappearance that no one could explain. To understand what happened to Eliza Harwood and why a frontier wedding could be undone by a wilderness that did not care about promises, it is necessary to step back from the clearing and examine the world these people lived in. The frontier wedding was not simply a ceremony. It was an act of survival. In the American West during the mid-19th century, marriage was a legal, social, and economic foundation for building a life in a place where formal institutions were scarce. A couple who married on the trail had few protections. There were no permanent churches, no clerks, no judges. The wedding was performed by circuit riders, by wagon masters, by anyone authorized by law or custom. In some cases, a marriage was simply declared by the couple with witnesses, and the paperwork was filed when they reached the nearest county seat. The ceremony itself was often short. It was surrounded by danger. The wedding of Samuel Clark and Eliza Harwood was typical in many ways. It was to be brief, practical, and binding. But it was also taking place in a territory where the rule of law was thin, where the population was sparse, and where a young woman in a torn dress could vanish into a forest that had not yet been fully mapped. The systems that should have protected Eliza Harwood were incomplete. There were no police. There were no telephones. The nearest military outpost was a week's travel away. The wagon train was its own government, and its rules were based on mutual trust. When that trust was broken, there was no way to enforce accountability. Isaac Thornton had joined the train 3 weeks earlier. No one had checked his background. There were no records. He said he was a farmer from Ohio, but no one in the train had ever been to Ohio. He said his party had broken up after a dispute, but no one from that party was present to confirm it. The wagon master had accepted his word. In the frontier, there was no other option. People were judged by their appearance, their behavior, their story. Isaac Thornton had appeared quiet and cooperative. He had helped repair a wheel and had shared his rations. That was enough. But the disappearance of Eliza Harwood raised a question that the train could not answer. Was it a voluntary departure or an abduction? The torn fabric suggested force, but the footprints suggested a meeting. The bride had walked to the creek at a normal pace. She had not run. She had not struggled at the point of first contact. It was only later in the forest that something had gone wrong. The searchers found no weapon, no evidence of a struggle beyond the torn dress. The couple had entered the forest together and only one of them had left. Neither was ever seen again. The possibility of a voluntary elopement was considered, but Eliza had not taken her belongings. She had left her dress, her bonnet, her keepsakes. If she was going to leave with Isaac Thornton, she would have needed those things. She left nothing. She simply walked away from the wagon and met him at the creek. And then the forest closed around them. The trail ended at the Rocky Creek bed. After that, there were no more footprints. The forest gave nothing back. The men of the search party returned with dirt under their nails and questions in their minds. They could not say where the couple had gone. They could not say what had happened. They could only report that the trail had disappeared into the stones and the water and the dark trees, and they had not been able to find it again. In the following weeks, the train continued westward. The story of the vanishing bride traveled with them. At the Fort Vancouver settlement, a report was made. A search party was sent out from the fort, but it found nothing. The record of the disappearance was written into the county ledger and then forgotten. No crime was ever charged because there was no body, no witness, no confession. The frontier had taken what it wanted. The wedding that never happened left a trail of human consequence. Samuel Clark lived a long life but did not marry. He died at the age of 57 in a farming accident. Eliza's mother, Mary Harwood, never accepted that her daughter had left willingly. She believed Isaac Thornton had taken her by force and killed her, or left her to die. She searched for her daughter for the rest of her life. She posted notices in newspapers in Oregon, Washington, California. She wrote letters to every courthouse she could find. She died in 1883, still uncertain. The grandmother, who had been 78 at the time of the disappearance, died of grief within the year. Eliza's sisters grew up and married and had children of their own, but they were never able to separate the memory of the wedding from the memory of the empty clearing. The mystery remains unsolved. No evidence ever emerged to explain what happened to Eliza Harwood and Isaac Thornton. The forest never released them. The creek never gave up their bones. Story, for those who have heard it, stands as a reminder of how thin the line was between civilization and the wild. The frontier wedding was meant to be a beginning. In this case, it became an erasure. The story of Eliza Harwood did not end in the clearing. It traveled with the train, but it also traveled through time. In the decades that followed, several attempts were made to reconstruct what had happened, but each effort ran into the same wall. No one had seen anything. No one had heard a struggle. The forest had absorbed the event completely. For historians, the case became a footnote, a minor tragedy in the larger story of westward expansion. But for the families involved, the absence of resolution created a wound that never healed. In 1874, a quarter century after the disappearance, a man named Luther Grimes arrived in the Willamette Valley. He had been a fur trapper in the Cascade Range and claimed to have knowledge of the Harwood case. He said that while trapping along a remote tributary of the Santiam River, he had come across the remains of a camp, old and weathered, with a woman's bonnet still hanging from a branch. He described the bonnet as blue calico with a white trim, matching the description of the bonnet Eliza had left behind in the wagon. Grimes said he had not disturbed the site. He had marked the location and intended to return, but never did. His story was written down by a local newspaper reporter and then promptly forgotten. No expedition was ever organized to verify his claim. By 1874, the trail was 30 years cold and the territory had changed. The forest had grown denser. The landmarks Grimes described no longer matched the maps. What is known is that the clearing where the wagon train had camped later became a homestead. The original site was surveyed in 1853. The land was claimed by a veteran of the Mexican-American War, who built a cabin and lived there until his death in 1867. The creek where Eliza had walked was diverted for irrigation in the 1880s. The rocky bank where her footprints had stopped was partially blasted away to make room for a road. The geography of the disappearance was altered, piece by piece, by the very settlement the wagon train had been trying to reach. The physical evidence, if any had remained, was erased, but the human evidence remained in the memory of the survivors. Among them was a woman named Martha Pendleton, who had been 16 years old at the time of the disappearance. She had been a friend of Eliza's. In 1901, at the age of 68, Martha gave an interview to a historical society in Salem, Oregon. She described the night of the wedding in great detail. She remembered the torn dress, the bonnet left on the wagon seat, the silence of the forest, and the way Samuel Clark had stared into the dark. She also remembered something she had never told anyone before. The day before the wedding, Eliza had confided in her. She said she was nervous about marrying Samuel, not because she did not love him, but because she feared the isolation. The wagon train was moving into a territory with no neighbors, no women to talk to, no doctors for 100 miles. She had asked Martha if she thought it was a mistake to marry and go so far. Martha had reassured her, but the doubt was already there. Martha also recalled that Isaac Thornton had been present during that conversation. He had been sitting nearby, repairing a leather strap. He had not looked up, but he had been close enough to hear. Martha wondered in the interview whether Isaac Thornton had taken Eliza's doubt as an opportunity. She said, "He was a quiet man, but not a good man. I could see it in his eyes." She had never spoken of it at the time because she had no proof. The Historical Society recorded her testimony and filed it away. It remains the closest thing to an explanation that exists. The question of motive, then, becomes central. Why would Isaac Thornton abduct a woman he had known for only 3 weeks? The historical record provides no answer. But the social context of the frontier offers a framework. The ratio of men to women in the Oregon Territory in 1849 was roughly 6 to 1. Women were scarce. Marriage was a necessity for many men, not just for companionship but for labor. A woman could cook, sew, tend children, manage a household. In a homestead without a woman, a man faced a much harder existence. The pressure to marry was immense. If Isaac Thornton had been unable to find a wife through conventional means, he may have seen Eliza as a target of opportunity. She was young, she was betrothed, but she was also vulnerable. She had expressed doubt. That doubt may have been the crack he exploited. The abduction, if it was an abduction, required planning. He had to know her movements. He had to know that she would walk to the creek alone that evening. He had to have a place to take her, a route through the forest that would conceal them. He did not take a horse because the horses were hobbled and guarded. He took only himself and her. That suggests he intended to walk, but the search party found no tracks beyond the creek. That suggests he knew the terrain. He had been with the train for 3 weeks, but he had also claimed to have traveled through that region before. He had told the wagon master that he had crossed the Rockies in 1846 and had spent time in the Umpqua Valley. If that was true, he had knowledge of the landscape that the others did not. He knew where the trails went, where the water led, where a person could disappear. The train did not have a map of the area. The captain, Silas Decker, relied on a general sense of direction and written instructions from earlier travelers. The territory between the trail and the Willamette Valley was not mapped in detail until the 1850s. The search party had no compass, no survey equipment. They followed the creek, but they did not know where it went. They turned back because they were afraid of getting lost themselves. In that context, the failure of the search was not a failure of effort. It was a failure of resources. The frontier did not have the tools to conduct a proper investigation. The systems that should have intervened were absent. There was no law enforcement agency that could be called. There was no telegraph line. The nearest post office was in Oregon City, a month's travel away. The wagon master had authority within the train, but once the train moved on, that authority dissolved. The case was never formally reported to a court. The county where the disappearance occurred did not exist yet. When the territory was eventually organized, the records of the train's passage were lost or destroyed. The disappearance of Eliza Harwood was never investigated by any official body. It remained a story told around fires, passed down through families, and eventually written down in local histories as a frontier mystery. The lack of investigation does not mean there were no consequences. The disappearance had a ripple effect on the laws and customs of later wagon trains. After 1850, many wagon masters began requiring that all unmarried men traveling alone provide a written reference from a previous town or a known associate. Some trains refused to allow single men to join at all unless they were related to a family. The fear of predators within the train became part of the collective memory. Women were instructed not to walk alone. Children were kept within sight of the wagons at all times. The freedom of the trail, which had seemed so open, became more guarded. The disappearance of Eliza Harwood, though never solved, changed the behavior of those who heard the story. But the story also changed with time. In the late 19th century, tales of the vanishing bride became popular in frontier folklore. Some versions added a supernatural element. They said that Eliza had been taken by spirits of the forest, that her ghost could still be seen walking along the creek on moonless nights. Other versions claimed that Isaac Thornton had been a fugitive, that he had murdered Eliza and buried her body in a cave that was never found. These stories served a purpose. They made the mystery more dramatic, more memorable, but they also obscured the truth. The real Eliza Harwood was a 17-year-old girl who had left her home in Missouri with her family, who had fallen in love and planned a wedding, and who had walked to a creek one evening and never returned. The documents that survive are scattered. The Harwood family Bible, now held in a museum in Portland, contains a handwritten note on the page between the Old and New Testaments. It reads, "Eliza lost June 10, 1849, never found, God keep her." The note is in the handwriting of her mother, Mary. The ink has faded, the page is brittle, but the words are still legible. They are the only direct record of the family's grief. In 1934, a construction crew building a logging road in the Cascade Range uncovered a human skeleton near the headwaters of the Santiam River. The skeleton was incomplete. The skull was missing. The bones were brought to a coroner in Eugene, who estimated they belonged to a young female, likely between the ages of 15 and 25. The remains were buried in a pauper's grave because no one claimed them. No attempt was made to connect them to the Harwood case. The distance between the skeleton and the creek where Eliza disappeared was approximately 40 miles as the crow flies. It would have been a week's travel on foot through rugged terrain. It is possible, but unproven. The coroner's report from 1934 mentions that the skeleton showed signs of trauma to the ribs and a healed fracture on the left arm. The fracture had occurred years before death. Eliza Harwood had never broken her arm. Her mother would have mentioned it, and she did not. The skeleton was likely not Eliza, but the report was filed and forgotten, and the possibility remains open. In the absence of evidence, the case has become a symbol. It represents the thousands of people who disappeared in the American West without explanation. Not all of them were victims of violence. Some died of disease, some of starvation, some of accidents. Some chose to leave and never return. But for those left behind, the uncertainty was a form of punishment. They could not mourn because they could not know. The frontier wedding, meant to be a public declaration of commitment, became a private tragedy of indeterminacy. The cultural significance of the frontier wedding itself is worth examining. In the mid-19th century, marriage on the trail was not just a ceremony. It was a legal contract that established property rights and inheritance. A woman who married on the trail gained the legal status of a married woman, which meant she could not own property independently, but she was also protected by the laws of coverture. Her husband was responsible for her debts and her safety. The wedding was the mechanism by which a woman transferred her legal identity from her father to her husband. Eliza Harwood's wedding to Samuel Clark would have transferred her legal identity to him. She would have become Eliza Clark, but that wedding never took place. She remained, in the legal sense, Eliza Harwood, but she also disappeared. Her father had died years earlier. Her mother had no legal standing to manage property. The family's claim to her inheritance was never settled. The law had no mechanism for a person who was neither dead nor alive. The frontier legal system, such as it was, had no procedure for declaring a missing person legally dead. That would not come until decades later, with the passage of probate codes in the state governments. The disappearance thus created a legal void. Samuel Clark could not remarry because he was still considered married, even though his bride had vanished. He could not prove her death. He could not obtain a divorce because there was no court anywhere near him. He was stuck in a legal limbo. He never remarried, not because he did not want to, but because he could not. The frontier had no mechanism for closure. This legal problem was widespread. In the 1850s, several state legislatures passed laws allowing a spouse to be declared legally dead after a period of 7 years of unexplained absence. But those laws applied only to residents of the state. Samuel Clark was a transient. He did not have a fixed residence for years. By the time he settled in the Willamette Valley, the 7-year period had passed, but the legal process required notification of the missing person, which was impossible. He remained legally married to a ghost. The story of Eliza Harwood is not unique. It is one of many such disappearances recorded in the annals of the American frontier, but it stands out because of the timing. The wedding was hours away. The dress was ready. The food was prepared. The family was present. The forest took her at the moment when her new life was supposed to begin. That irony has kept the story alive. In the 1970s, a local historian named Richard Cutter compiled a collection of Oregon frontier mysteries. He devoted an entire chapter to the Harwood case. He interviewed descendants of the wagon train families. He examined the surviving court records. He traced the route of the train using old maps. He concluded that the most likely explanation was abduction followed by murder, with the body concealed in a location that was later altered by natural forces. He noted that the creek had flooded several times in the decades following the disappearance, which could have washed away any remains. He also noted that the area was known for bear activity. A bear could have dragged a body and scattered the bones. But Cutter admitted that his conclusion was speculation. The evidence, he wrote, does not exist. The case remains open in the historical sense. No solution has been found. No document has surfaced that explains the events of June 10, 1849. The story continues to be told, not because it can be solved, but because it resists solution. It is a mystery that has no answer, and that may be the most honest reflection of the frontier itself. The wilderness did not care about human plans. It did not provide closure. It only took and it kept. On the morning of June 11, 1849, at sunrise, a search party of 12 men assembled at the edge of the Harwood camp. They were led by Mary Harwood's brother, Thomas Baker, a farmer from Missouri who had joined the train only 3 days earlier. At 5:47 a.m., they set out along the creek where Eliza had last been seen. The men carried rifles, axes, and a single lantern. The plan was to follow the water downstream for 3 miles, then loop back upstream through the timber. They expected to find her within hours. She was a young woman in a white dress. She would be visible against the dark brush. They did not find her. At 8:30 a.m., the party reached a beaver dam that blocked the creek. The water had pooled into a deep, murky pond. One of the men, a former trapper named Jacob Hines, suggested that the body could be trapped beneath the dam. He waded into the water with a long pole. He probed the bottom for nearly 40 minutes. He found nothing but mud and submerged logs. At 9:15 a.m., they abandoned the dam and continued downstream. At 10:40 a.m., they encountered a clearing where the creek widened into a shallow, rocky bed. The ground was soft from recent rain. They found footprints. They were small, consistent with a woman's shoe, and they led away from the water into the forest. The search party followed the footprints for approximately 200 yards. Then the tracks disappeared on a patch of hard-packed earth. The men spread out in a line. They searched for another hour. They found no further signs. At 12:15 p.m., Thomas Baker called a halt. The men had covered nearly 4 miles of creek and forest. They had found nothing. He sent 2 riders back to the camp to fetch food and water. The rest continued searching, but their confidence was fading. By 2 p.m., the party had covered 6 miles. They had seen no fresh animal kills, no torn clothing, no signs of a struggle. The forest was silent. At 4:30 p.m., the search party returned to the camp. The families had gathered near the Thornton wagon. The bride dress still hung from the tent pole. Isaac Thornton stood apart from the group. He had not joined the search. He claimed he was too exhausted, but some of the men noted that he had not shed tears. They whispered that he was hiding something. What happened in the hours that followed remains unclear. No written record survives of the conversations that took place that evening, but oral accounts passed down through the families describe a growing tension. Isaac Thornton insisted that the search should continue the next day. Mary Harwood refused. She believed her daughter was dead. She wanted the train to move on. She said the wilderness would not give her back. The train remained in camp for 2 more days. On June 12th, a second search party of 15 men, including Thornton, scoured the surrounding hills. They used dogs borrowed from a settler's homestead 10 miles south. The dogs picked up a scent near the base of a ridge, but they lost it at the edge of a steep ravine. The men descended the ravine. At the bottom, they found an abandoned trapper's shack. The door was open. Inside, they found a crude bed, a pile of animal bones, and a single button. The button was white. It matched the buttons on Eliza's dress. The button was brought back to camp. Mary Harwood identified it. She broke down. She said it was the same pattern she had sewn onto the dress herself. The men returned to the shack the next morning. They searched the surrounding area for a quarter mile in every direction. They found nothing else. No body, no scraps of fabric, no sign that anyone had been there in years. The shack raised questions that were never answered. Who had built it? A trapper, a prospector, a fugitive? The button suggested that Eliza had been there, but it did not prove how or when. The pressure was mounting. The wagon train had lost 3 days. The season was turning. Other families began to voice their impatience. They had left late. They could not afford more delays. On June 14th, the decision was made to move on. Isaac Thornton refused to leave. He remained at the camp alone for 3 more days, searching the woods by himself. On June 17th, he caught up with the train, having walked 30 miles in 2 days. He brought no news. He never spoke of the search again. He married another woman 3 years later in California. That marriage lasted until his death. He never mentioned Eliza. The disappearance of Eliza Harwood was not the only event of its kind on the Oregon Trail. Historical records from the decade between 1845 and 1855 document at least 73 similar cases of individuals vanishing without trace during wagon train journeys. Most were children, some were elderly, a few were young women. The common thread was the absence of organized response. The wagon trains had no formal leadership, no law enforcement, and no means of communication with the outside world. Families made decisions on their own. If a person vanished, the search was limited by time, resources, and the collective will of the group. The system failed because there was no system. The frontier operated on improvisation. When a traveler disappeared, the group had to weigh the value of a single life against the survival of the entire train. That calculation was brutal but honest. The trail killed. Disease, accident, and violence were normal. The search for a missing person was a luxury that few could afford. In the case of Eliza Harwood, the system's failure was compounded by a missed signal. On the evening of June 10th, after she had been missing for only 2 hours, a rider from a neighboring train arrived at the camp. He reported that a half-mile upstream near the old beaver dam, someone had seen a flash of white fabric moving through the trees. The rider had not investigated. He had assumed it was a deer. The Harwood camp relayed this information to the search party the next morning, but by then the trail was cold. The flash of white was never seen again. How could a single observation, dismissed as an animal, have changed the outcome? If the rider had investigated immediately, if the search had begun at sunset instead of first light, would they have found her alive? The question cannot be answered, but it haunts the story. The missing signal is the one detail that continues to be discussed in local history circles. The white flash, the dismissed observation, the lost hour. In 1958, a forestry survey team working in the same region discovered a small clearing approximately 2 miles from the site of the old beaver dam. The clearing contained the remains of a fire pit and a fragment of what appeared to be a woman's comb made of bone. The comb was carbon dated to the mid-19th century. It was found near a set of human teeth, all molars, consistent with a young adult. The teeth showed no signs of trauma. The Forest Service reported the find to the Oregon State Historical Society, but no further investigation was conducted. The location was not publicized. The comb and teeth were stored in a box in a basement. They remained there. The question of what happened to Eliza Harwood continues to generate theories. One theory holds that she was taken by a lone drifter who had been seen near the train in the days before the disappearance. A man named Ezra Phelps had approached the train asking for food. He was described as short, with a beard and a limp. He was given bread and told to move on. He was last seen heading north toward the creek on June 9th. No one saw him after the disappearance. He was never found. Another theory suggests that Isaac Thornton was involved, that he had been abusive during the brief courtship, and that Eliza had fled the camp voluntarily. No evidence supports this. Thornton's later life showed no pattern of violence, but the suspicion persists. The case matters not because it can be solved, but because it represents a recurring problem on the American frontier: the vulnerability of women in isolated spaces. The frontier wedding was supposed to mark a transition to safety and stability. For Eliza Harwood, it marked the opposite. She stepped out of the protective circle of the camp and into a world that had no oversight, no rescue, and no accountability. The wilderness took her, and the system had no way to respond. In the decades that followed, the story of the frontier wedding became a cautionary tale. It was told to young women preparing to cross the plains. It was used to justify restrictions on their movements. It reinforced the idea that the trail was a dangerous place for women alone, but it also became a story of endurance. The Harwood family continued west. Mary Harwood died in Oregon in 1870. She never stopped believing that her daughter might one day return. She left a will that included a provision for Eliza, a small parcel of land held in trust in case she ever came back. That land was sold long ago. The trust was dissolved in 1940. The story of Eliza Harwood is not a mystery that can be solved with modern forensics. The remains, if they exist, are scattered or buried under decades of growth. The witnesses are gone. The documents are few. What remains is the narrative itself, and the questions it asks about trust, safety, and the limits of community in the face of the unknown. On June 10, 1849, a bride walked into the forest and did not return. The frontier did not provide an answer. Over 170 years later, it still does not. On the morning of July 18, 1852, a young woman named Martha Jenkins prepared for her wedding. She was 22 years old. Her fiancé was a farmer named Jacob Hollister, 24. They had met in Independence, Missouri, 5 months earlier, while both were waiting for their wagon trains to form. The wedding was to take place at the Sweetwater River Crossing, a landmark on the Oregon Trail where the water was shallow and the grass was good. The ceremony was scheduled for noon. By 11:30, the guests had assembled. There were 60 people from 4 different trains. The bride wore a blue calico dress that she had saved for the journey. The groom wore a clean shirt borrowed from a man named Thomas Gleason. The minister was a Methodist circuit rider who happened to be passing through the area on his way to Fort Hall. The ceremony began at 12:10. It lasted 15 minutes. No one recorded the vows. No photographs exist. What is known comes from a single letter written by a woman named Eleanor Platt to her sister in Ohio 3 weeks later. The letter is held in the archives of the Oregon Historical Society. In it, Platt wrote that the wedding was the first joyful event the trains had seen in weeks. They had already lost 3 people to cholera. The marriage felt like a promise that life could continue. After the ceremony, there was a small feast: salt pork, hardtack, dried apples, and coffee. The bride and groom sat together on a canvas tarp spread over the sagebrush. They received gifts: a pair of wool blankets, a cast-iron skillet, a pouch of tobacco, a sewing kit. The mood was light. By 2:30, the celebration was over. The wagons had to move. The Sweetwater crossing was still 3 miles ahead. Jacob and Martha Hollister climbed into their wagon and resumed their journey. What happened in the next 3 hours is not entirely clear. The train crossed the river without incident. They traveled another 4 miles before stopping for the night. At 7 in the evening, a man named Samuel Gibbs noticed that the Hollisters' wagon had not yet pulled into the circle. He rode back to check on them. He found the wagon stopped on the trail, the oxen standing in the traces, the canvas cover still tied down. The wagon was empty. Inside, there was a half-eaten biscuit, a tin cup of cold coffee, and a shawl draped across the seat. There was no sign of struggle. The wagon had not been ransacked. The contents were undisturbed. Gibbs called out. No answer. He walked into the brush along the trail. He found nothing. He returned to camp and reported what he had seen. A search party was organized within the hour. 15 men, torches, dogs. They searched until midnight. They found no trace of Jacob or Martha Hollister. The next morning, the search resumed. The trail was examined for tracks. There were many tracks. The area was used by multiple trains. The dogs did not pick up a scent. The search was called off after 2 days. The wagon was divided among the other families. The oxen were shared out. The belongings were allocated to those who had lost their own goods to river crossings or axle breaks. The wedding gifts were given to a newlywed couple from Illinois. The sewing kit ended up in the hands of a 12-year-old girl named Abigail Porter, who used it for the rest of her life. She later donated it to a museum in Oregon City, where it remains. The label on the display reads, "Sewing kit from the wedding of Jacob and Martha Hollister, who disappeared on the Oregon Trail in 18 The case of the Hollisters is unusual because two people vanished together. In nearly all other recorded disappearances on the trail, it was a single individual. The simultaneous loss of both husband and wife on their wedding day raised questions that were never answered. One theory is that they were attacked by a small party of Shoshone raiders, but Shoshone accounts from that period do not mention any such incident in the Sweetwater area. Another theory is that they drowned while attempting to cross a smaller tributary downstream, but the water levels that July were low. A third theory is that they intentionally left the train, perhaps to start a new life elsewhere. There is no evidence to support this. Their families in Missouri received no further word. No one came forward to claim their property. The most detailed investigation of the Hollister disappearance was conducted in 1939 by a local historian named Raymond Poole. Poole interviewed descendants of surviving members of the wagon train and collected oral histories. He identified a pattern of suppressed memory. Several of the families had passed down a story that a man named Charles Eckhart, a driver from another train, had reported seeing the Hollisters' wagon stopped near a grove of cottonwoods at around 4 in the afternoon on the day they vanished. Eckhart said he had seen a man and a woman walking away from the wagon toward the river, but he did not recognize them. He assumed they were a married couple taking a walk. He did not stop. That sighting was never recorded in the official train journal. It only surfaced in 1902 when Eckhart's granddaughter wrote a letter to the Oregonian newspaper describing her grandfather's account. By then, Eckhart was dead. The question of why the search was so brief is tied to the same pressures that limited the search for Eliza Harwood. The season was short. The mountains had to be crossed before October. Every day of delay risked winter entrapment. The train that lost the Hollisters was already behind schedule. They had spent extra days at Fort Laramie waiting for replacement oxen. They could not afford to lose more time. The decision to abandon the search was made unanimously by the heads of households. The vote was recorded in the train's journal, moved to proceed at dawn, carried. Jacob and Martha Hollister were listed as dead in the train's official census. No bodies were found. No grave was dug. They were simply written off. The journal recorded their names, the date of their disappearance, and the word missing. That is the only official record. But the story did not end there. In 1978, a hiker exploring the bluffs above the Sweetwater River found a human femur and part of a pelvis in a narrow canyon about 6 miles from the Hollisters' last known location. The bones were examined by a forensic anthropologist from the University of Wyoming. The bones were determined to be from a young adult female, consistent with Martha Hollister's age and build. But there was no way to confirm identity. The bones were not accompanied by any clothing, personal effects, or other remains. The hiker marked the location but did not return. The bones were stored at the university and later misplaced. They have not been recovered. The canyon where the bones were found is accessible only by a steep, rocky trail that would have been difficult for a woman in a calico dress and leather boots. How Martha Hollister might have ended up there remains unexplained. One possibility is that she was chased. Another is that she was lost. A third is that she was carried. Without the full skeleton, without context, the bones cannot tell their story. The failure of the search for the Hollisters is not a failure of effort. It is a failure of system. The wagon train had no protocol for a double disappearance. No one knew who was in charge. No one had a map. No one had a radio. The available technology was limited to torches, dogs, and human legs. The terrain was rough, the distances were large, and the time was short. The search was conducted by men who were also responsible for the safety of their own families. They could not stay forever. The broader pattern is clear. Between 1840 and 1860, at least 300,000 people traveled the Oregon Trail. Of those, an estimated 20,000 died. Disease caused the majority of deaths. Accidents caused the next largest number. But disappearances, though rare, were the most unsettling. They left no closure. They left no grave. They left families with unanswered questions that lasted for generations. The frontier wedding, meant to symbolize hope and continuity, became in these cases a symbol of the opposite. The vows were spoken, but the future they promised was erased. The wedding day was supposed to be the beginning. Instead, it was the end. In the decades after the Hollister disappearance, the story changed. It became a cautionary tale told to discourage young couples from marrying on the trail. It became a ghost story, whispered around campfires. Some versions claimed that on certain nights, a woman in a blue calico dress could be seen walking along the bluffs above the Sweetwater, calling out a name that no one could hear. The story matters because it exposes the fragility of community on the frontier. The wagon train was a temporary society, bound by mutual necessity. It had no legal authority, no police, no courts, no means of investigating a crime or a disappearance. It had only the will of the group, and that will was limited. When a couple vanished, the group had to choose between searching and surviving. In every documented case, the group chose survival. The frontier wedding was not just a personal milestone. It was a social product, a thread in the fabric of westward expansion. Each wedding was a small ceremony that confirmed the continuity of settlement. Each disappearance tore that thread, and because the system had no way to repair it, the tear remained. Today, the sites where these weddings took place are mostly unmarked. The Sweetwater Crossing is a bend in the river near a dirt road. The Cottonwood Grove where the Hollisters' wagon was last seen is gone, replaced by sage and cheatgrass. The canyon where the bone was found is a nameless drainage on a topographic map. The stories are preserved only in archives, in letters, in the labels of museum artifacts, and in the oral traditions of families who still remember. The frontier wedding, vows on the edge of the wilderness, was a promise made in a place that could not enforce it. The wilderness did not care. It still does not. The ground gives nothing back. The missing remain missing. The search continues only in memory. At approximately 2 in the afternoon on the 23rd of June, 1854, a wagon belonging to the Carter family pulled away from the main train near Ash Hollow in what is now western Nebraska. The train was a large one, numbering 47 wagons bound for the Willamette Valley. That morning, a wedding had taken place. Samuel Carter, age 24, married Emily Bidwell, age 22. The ceremony was brief, conducted by a Methodist minister traveling with the train. After a noon meal, the newlyweds were given permission to walk a short distance from the camp to gather wild berries for a wedding supper. They took a basket and a small water jug. They were seen heading toward a grove of cottonwoods along the north bank of the Platte River. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. By 6 in the evening, the Carter family became concerned. Emily's mother, Margaret Bidwell, asked the train captain to send a search party. A group of 6 men, including Samuel's brother John, set out on foot. They called the couple's names. They found the basket and the water jug near a patch of chokecherry bushes about 400 yards from the river. The basket still held berries. The jug was half full. There were footprints both sets leading toward the river, but the river was wide and shallow, no more than 3 feet deep at the crossing. The men waded across. On the opposite bank, they found one of Emily's hairpins. That was all. What happened? The search continued through the night. Torches were lit. The train captain ordered a full halt the next day. Men on horseback rode miles in every direction. They found no sign of Samuel or Emily. The river was dragged with ropes and hooks. Nothing. The train held a meeting on the morning of the 25th. The decision to stay another day was narrowly passed. On the 26th, a Sioux hunting party was spotted on the bluffs to the north. The train's scout, a man named William Gentry, approached them. Through an interpreter, the Sioux leader said they had seen no white people, no couple, no bodies. Gentry did not believe him, but there was no way to prove otherwise. The train had to move on. The Carters and the Bidwells were left with nothing but grief. Investigators later reconstructed the timeline. The couple had walked about a mile from camp. The river was slow. The berry patch was easy to reach. There was no sign of a struggle. The footprints did not show a run. Everything indicated a calm departure. The most likely explanation, written in the train's final report, was an accidental drowning. But the river was so shallow that a standing adult would have been barely submerged. Another theory was quicksand. The Platte had pockets of soft sediment that could swallow a person. But no one had ever seen quicksand take two people at once without a struggle. A third theory was abduction by the Sioux. Yet no ransom demand, no trade, no return of clothing ever surfaced. The Sioux of that region rarely took white women. There was no motive. The systems that failed were the same as those that failed the Hollisters. The train had no standard search procedure. The decision to stay or leave was made by vote, not by protocol. The scout had no authority to demand cooperation from the Sioux. The leader of the Sioux party, a man named Red Cloud, not yet the famous war chief, told Gentry that the river was cursed. He said that 3 winters earlier, a Pawnee war party had killed a Sioux woman and her child on that same bank. He suggested that the spirits of the dead had taken the white couple. Gentry reported this to the train captain, who recorded it in his journal. The Sioux thinking the place is haunted. I do not know what to make of it. The wagon train left Ash Hollow on the 27th of June. The Carter family and the Bidwell family were advised to continue. They had no choice. They traveled in silence. Samuel's brother John never forgave himself. He wrote a letter to his mother in Missouri dated December 1854 after reaching Oregon. We searched until we could not search anymore. The ground did not give them back. The river did not give them back. I do not know what took them. I only know they are gone. In 1875, a homesteader near Ash Hollow found a woman's wedding ring in a badger hole about 3 miles downstream from the berry patch. The ring was gold with a small garnet. It matched the description of Emily Carter's ring, given by her mother in an 1855 letter to the Oregonian. The homesteader sold the ring to a traveling jeweler. It disappeared into a private collection. No one ever saw it again. The Carter disappearance was documented in the records of the Oregon Trail Emigrant Society, but the details were sparse. The train's journal ended with a single line: "Lost Samuel and Emily Carter, married the day they went missing. Search fruitless." Proceeded west. The frontier wedding, Vows on the edge of the wilderness, was a promise made in a place that could not enforce it. The wilderness did not care. It still does not. The ground gives nothing back. The missing remain missing. The search continues only in memory. At 3 in the afternoon on the 9th of September, 1852, a wedding party gathered near the banks of the Humboldt River in what is now northeastern Nevada. The bride was Sarah Hargrave, 20 years old. The groom was Thomas Millbrook, 26. The ceremony was performed by a fellow immigrant who had been a justice of the peace in Illinois. The train, known as the Spring Creek Wagon Company, consisted of 31 wagons bound for California. The wedding was a rare moment of celebration on a journey that had already claimed 3 lives to cholera. The couple exchanged vows under a makeshift canopy of wool blankets stretched between 2 wagons. After the ceremony, a small feast was held: dried apples, hardtack, and coffee. By 4 o'clock, the train resumed its westward march. Thomas and Sarah rode in a separate wagon loaned to them by Sarah's father, Jonathan Hargrave. At 5:15, the train began crossing a wide, alkali flat south of the Humboldt. The ground was cracked and white. The sun was still high. The Millbrook wagon lagged behind the main group. Jonathan Hargrave noticed the distance and slowed his own wagon to wait. He saw the Millbrook wagon stop. He saw Thomas climb down and walk around the rear wheel. Then he saw Sarah step down as well. They appeared to be examining something on the axle. Jonathan called out to them. Thomas waved back. That was the last exchange. By 5:45, the Millbrook wagon had not resumed. Jonathan rode back with 2 other men. The wagon was sitting empty. The oxen were standing calmly, still yoked. The brake was set. A canteen and a tin cup lay on the seat. There were footprints leading away from the wagon toward a low ridge of sagebrush about 200 yards to the south. The men followed the tracks. They reached the ridge. The tracks continued over the crest. On the other side, the ground opened into a series of shallow ravines. The tracks disappeared into the dry, rocky soil. There was no sign of Thomas or Sarah. What happened? The train captain ordered a halt. A search party of 12 men fanned out across the ravines. They searched until dark. They lit lanterns. They called the couple's names. No answer. The next morning, the search resumed. A rider was sent to the nearest settlement, a trading post 50 miles east at the Humboldt Sink. The trader sent back a message. No bodies had been found. The search continued for 2 days. On the third day, 2 Paiute women were encountered gathering seeds near a spring. Through a sign language interpreter, the women said they had seen a white man and woman walking southward. Not running, not chased, just walking. They pointed toward a range of low mountains 20 miles away. The train captain sent 3 men on horseback to scout the mountains. They found nothing. The systems that failed here were not structural or mechanical, they were human. The newlyweds had no reason to leave the wagon. They had no supplies for a journey on foot. The terrain was barren. There was no evidence of an attack, no blood, no torn clothing, no displaced stones. Investigators later speculated about desertion, but that made no sense. The couple had just married. They had family in the train. They had no known quarrel. Another theory, they became disoriented. The alkali flat could cause mirages. The ridge might have looked like a shortcut, but the tracks were straight and deliberate. They did not wander. The most plausible explanation recorded in the train's ledger was that the couple had walked off to find privacy for a short time, perhaps to talk in private after the emotional ceremony, and then lost their bearings. But the ledge was only 200 yards from the wagon. A person standing on that ridge could see the entire train. The sun was still up. The terrain was not confusing. The Spring Creek Wagon Company left the area on the 12th of September. Jonathan Hargrave stayed behind for 3 more days with his remaining son, Henry. They searched alone. On the 15th, Henry wrote in his diary, "We have walked every ravine. We have called until our voices are gone. There is nothing. The ground is hungry." Thomas and Sarah Millbrook were never seen again. In 1876, a surveyor mapping the route of the Central Pacific Railroad found a human skull in a washout near the base of those low mountains. The skull had been weathered and cracked. Next to it, a small metal button embossed with the word Chicago. The button was of a type common on men's coats in the 1850s. The surveyor reported the find to the local Indian agent, who filed a note. No further investigation was made. The button was lost. The frontier wedding, Vows on the edge of the wilderness, was a promise made in a place that could not enforce it. The wilderness did not care. It still does not. The ground gives nothing back. The missing remain missing. The search continues only in memory.